The rain didn't fall on Chicago that night. It came down like the sky had a debt to settle. Maren Delaney pulled her thin jacket tighter and hurried through the flooded streets. 26 years old, quiet, with the kind of soft face that made strangers assume her life was easy. It wasn't. She cleared tables and wiped down floors on the graveyard shift, went home to a sister who needed her, and counted every dollar twice. She wasn't looking for trouble that night. She was just trying to get out of the storm. But one unlocked door changed everything. A warm, quiet room, a stranger she'd never met, tall and broad, wearing money like a second skin, his eyes dark and his balance unsteady. Neither of them was thinking clearly. Neither of them said a name. And in the space of one reckless night, a woman who'd spent her whole life being overlooked gave a piece of herself to a man she knew nothing about. She had no idea who he really was. She had no idea what he controlled, what he'd done, or how far the shadows behind him stretched. She lost her innocence to a stranger that night, never knowing he was the most powerful mafia boss in the city. And by the time she found out, it'd already be far too late to walk away. If stories about survival, dignity, and love born in the middle of danger are the kind you love, do us a favor, tap that like button, share this with someone who'd enjoy it, and subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Now, let's go back to that rain-soaked night, and the door that changed both of their lives forever. Morning light slipped through a narrow gap in the heavy curtains and touched Maren's eyelids before she could even remember where she was. And for one brief, fragile moment, all she felt was the strange warmth of a blanket far too soft, a mattress far too comfortable, and a room carrying the faint scent of polished wood and expensive soap, scents she had never once known in the cramped apartment where she had spent her entire life. Then memory came rushing back like water breaking over a riverbank, and she bolted upright, her heart pounding, both hands clutching the edge of the blanket, as though it might somehow conceal the panic rising inside her chest. The unfamiliar room opened before her in a silence so refined and luxurious that it made her feel painfully out of place, with its dark, toned walls, the thick carpet beneath her feet, and the tall window overlooking a city still drenched from the night's rain. She didn't dare breathe too loudly. She didn't dare move. She simply sat there listening to the violent beat of her own heart, while trying to piece together the blurred fragments of the night before. And the harder she tried, the more deeply shame trembled through her body. She wouldn't allow herself to think about what had happened. She only knew that she had done something she could never take back, with a man whose name she didn't even know. And the thought tightened her throat, stung her eyes, and set both cheeks burning with a humiliation unlike anything she had ever tasted before. Beside her, the man was still sleeping deeply, his breathing slow, heavy, and even, his face turned away in the dim shadows, and Maren didn't dare look at him for long. She was afraid that if she looked for even one more second, she would fall apart completely. So she carefully drew the blanket aside and lowered her feet to the floor, each movement measured and cautious, like a thief creeping through the ruins of her own dignity. She found her dress, still damp and draped over the back of a chair, her thin coat not yet fully dry, and her worn flats with their fraying heels, and she put them on as quietly as she could, her hands shaking so badly that she had to try twice before fastening the buttons. Every breath the man took behind her made her flinch, terrified that he would wake and see her, terrified that she would have to face the eyes of a stranger beneath the merciless light of day. She took nothing. She needed to make that clear to herself when her eyes passed over the expensive watch resting on the table and the thick leather wallet beside it. She even stepped farther away from them, as though merely standing too close might make her into something shameful. Because the only thing she still possessed in this life was her self-respect, and no matter how poor she became, she wouldn't trade it away. She opened the bedroom door with infinite care, holding her breath when the hinge gave a faint creak, then stepped into the long, carpeted hallway of a place she knew with absolute certainty she didn't belong. Keeping her head lowered, she walked quickly past the silent closed doors, avoiding the gaze of a security guard standing at the far end of the corridor. And only when she finally made it outside, when the bitter air left behind by the rain struck her face, did she feel able to breathe again, though even that breath was still tangled with tears. The morning city was wet and gray, with puddles lingering across the sidewalks and reflecting the heavy sky above, and Maren walked for a long distance because she couldn't afford a cab, wrapping both arms around herself against the cold, her head bowed, her heart crowded with emotions she couldn't name. There was shame, there was fear, and above all, there was that old loneliness, so familiar it had long since become part of her flesh. When she finally reached the aging apartment building where she lived, the one with an elevator that never worked, and hallways steeped in the smell of damp walls and mildew. She stopped outside the door of her tiny apartment, drew a deep breath, hurriedly wiped the corner of her eye with the back of her hand, and forced her face into something resembling normal before sliding the key into the lock. Because someone was waiting for her inside, someone she could never allow to see her weak. Nell was only 12 years old, thin and pale, curled up on the worn sofa with a light blanket pulled all the way to her chin, and when she heard her sister opening the door, she lifted her head, her large eyes brightening with relief. "Marin, I thought something had happened to you. The rain was so heavy. I was so worried." That single sentence was enough to make Marin's heart tighten painfully. She hurried across the room, knelt beside her sister, and placed a hand against the girl's forehead, a familiar gesture of checking that had become instinct after so many years. "I'm sorry. The rain got so bad that I had to take shelter. Are you feeling tired? Did you have trouble breathing again last night?" Nell only shook her head and gave her a weak smile, but Marin saw the faint, bluish pallor of her lips, heard the subtle unevenness in each quiet breath, and knew better than anyone that her little sister's heart was growing weaker with every passing month. The doctor had first spoken of surgery half a year earlier. He had spoken of figures that made Marin feel dizzy every time she remembered them. Figures so enormous that even if she saved every penny from her night shifts clearing tables for the rest of her life, it still wouldn't be enough. She had hidden the truth from Nell, just as she had hidden her own fear, because she was all the child had left in the world after their mother died, just as Nell was everything Marin had left. She straightened the blanket around her sister, prepared a cup of warm water, then sat beside her and gently stroked her hair, and in that fragile moment of peace, she pushed the shame of the previous night as far down inside herself as she could. She told herself it didn't matter, that it had only been a mistake that would fade with time, and that no one would ever know, that the only thing worthy of her concern now was finding enough money to save her little sister's heart before it was too late, and she had no idea that the night she wanted only to forget would follow her for a very long time, in ways she could never have imagined. Roark Halloran awoke with a dull ache pulsing from the back of his neck, his head feeling as though it had been packed with wet cotton, and the first thing he realized was that he couldn't remember most of what had happened the night before, something that had never happened to a man who controlled every smallest detail of his life. He lay still for several seconds, staring at the ceiling and trying to summon the memories back, but all he could grasp were scattered fragments slipping through his fingers, the smell of rain blowing in through an open door, a glass of liquor someone had poured for him during a meeting he now knew with certainty had been a trap, the burning heat spreading through his body, and the strange unsteadiness clouding his mind. Something he had fought against and yet hadn't been able to stop, and somewhere within that haze there had been a face, the face of a woman soaked through by the rain, her eyes wide with fear, a face he couldn't connect to a name or a history no matter how hard he tried. He sat up and pressed a hand to his temple, and at once the instincts of a man who had spent his entire life surrounded by suspicion told him that something was wrong. Not only that he had been drugged, but that there was a very specific emptiness against his chest, and when his hand rose to his throat out of habit, searching for the object that had always rested there, his heart suddenly went cold. The silver crest of the Halloran family was gone, the chain he hadn't removed in more than 20 years, the only thing left to him from his dead father, an object that in his world wasn't merely jewelry but a symbol of authority, of blood, of everything he had bled to protect. And now it no longer hung against his skin. He surged to his feet, the pain in his head swallowed by fury, and tore back the blankets, bent to inspect every corner of the floor, and even yanked open the bedside drawers. But there was nothing. The crest had truly vanished from the room as though it had never existed, and in that moment the rain-soaked face of the woman returned to his mind, faint yet relentless, and a cold suspicion began to harden inside him. He pulled out his phone and called a familiar number, and after only 2 rings, Booker's voice came through the other end, calm and alert, as always, the man who had been at his side for nearly 10 years, the only person in this world Roark could still trust to any degree. And Roark spoke only a few words in the low, frigid tone every man beneath him feared. "Come to the lodge, now. Something happened." Less than 20 minutes later, Booker arrived and closed the door behind him. And the instant he saw his employer's face, he understood that this was no small matter, because Roark Halloran rarely allowed emotion to show. Yet now there was something in his dark eyes that was both rage and something disturbingly close to hurt. "I was drugged last night," Roark said, each word heavy as stone. "The meeting with the men from the harbor was a trap, and someone took advantage of me while I wasn't fully conscious and stole my family crest. I want to know who did it. I want to know what truly happened in this room, every single minute of it." Booker nodded without speaking, his eyes sweeping over the room like a hunter reading tracks. Then he asked carefully, "Do you remember anything at all? A face, a name, anything?" Rourke remained silent for a long moment, weighing how much he should reveal, because even with Booker he wasn't accustomed to exposing weakness, and at last he said only, "There was a woman. I don't know who she was. I can't remember clearly, but she was here, and I need you to find her." Inside Rourke's mind, the past, which had always slept beneath a layer of ice, stirred faintly, because this wasn't the first time someone had betrayed him. He had learned that lesson years ago through blood and loss, when the man he had once considered closer than a brother sold him out in exchange for power, and from that day forward, Rourke had built a wall around himself without a single opening, trusting no one, loving no one, allowing no one close enough to wound him again. Now the loss of the crest wasn't simply the loss of an object. It tore open the fragile new skin over an old wound. It reminded him that no matter how powerful he became, there would always be someone waiting for the moment he let down his guard so they could drive a knife into his back. He walked to the window and looked down at the city, waking beneath a sky still carrying the damp breath of rain, both hands clenched behind him, and in that silence there radiated from him a cold authority that kept Booker motionless and unwilling to interrupt, because they both understood that when Rourke Halloran decided to hunt for something, even the entire city wasn't large enough for the person he sought to hide. "Find her," Rourke said softly, though every word seemed to cut through the air. "Use every resource we have, cameras, hotel staff, anyone who was near this place last night. I want to know who she is, where she lives, and most importantly, whether she was the one who took my crest. And if she was, she'll answer to me." Booker nodded one final time and quietly left, leaving Rourke alone in the room, where a faint, unfamiliar fragrance still lingered, something gentle and out of place within his world of steel and darkness. And though he had no way of knowing it, the search he had just ordered, the cold command born of anger and distrust, would uncover a chain of truths even he could never have anticipated, and it would lead him to the one person capable of shaking the walls he had spent half his life building. Marin's nights always began just as the city started sinking into darkness, when everyone else was making their way home and she was only then pulling her thin coat over her shoulders, kissing Nell on the forehead, reminding her to take her medicine on time, locking the door behind her, and stepping outside to catch the final bus that would carry her to the bar where she worked. Her job was to clean, wipe down tables, collect glasses, straighten chairs, and scrub the floors after the last customers had gone. Quiet work that no one ever noticed, and Marin didn't mind that, because she would rather remain invisible than be noticed in the way she feared, especially since there was one man at the bar who always looked at her in a way that made her skin crawl. Sutton Vane, the bar manager, a man in his late 40s with a smile that always seemed to be calculating something and eyes that moved over women as though pricing merchandise, was someone Marin constantly tried to avoid. But tonight, just like every other night, he found her while she was wiping down the counter, standing closer than necessary, leaning against the polished wood, and offering remarks he called jokes, but that were, in truth, little needles meant to pierce beneath her skin. "You know, Marin, a pretty girl like you shouldn't waste her life scrubbing floors," he said in a thick, oily voice. "All you have to do is be a little more agreeable. Learn how to make me happy, and your life could become a whole lot easier." Marin only tightened her grip on the rag in her hand, and kept her voice steady as she told him she came there to work, not to listen to things like that, then slipped past him toward another table, her back straight and her chin raised, refusing to let him see that her heart was pounding with disgust and fear. But Sutton Vane wasn't a man who accepted rejection easily, and what made him dangerous wasn't only his shamelessness but the hidden power he held over her, because several months earlier, when Nell had suffered a heart attack and needed to be rushed to the hospital, and Marin had run out of every possible way to find money, he had been the one who lent her what she needed, a sum she had believed at the time was a lifeline, but which had now become a noose tightening around her neck with each passing week. He followed her all the way to the next table, lowering his voice into a whisper more frightening than any shout. "Don't forget how much you owe me, Marin. The interest keeps growing every week, and I'm not a patient man forever, but I am an understanding one. Treat me a little better, and maybe I'll forget a few of those payments." Every word he spoke made Marin feel sick, but she wouldn't allow herself to cry in front of him. She only looked him directly in the eye and said in a quiet but unyielding voice that she would repay every last cent, on time, and that she would never repay him with anything but money. That was her final boundary. Her dignity was the only possession neither poverty nor men like Sutton Vane had managed to take from her, and though there were moments when exhaustion pressed so heavily upon her that she wanted to collapse in the middle of the cold floor and weep, she always forced herself back to her feet, always wiped her tears away before anyone could see them. Because she knew there was a little sister waiting at home who had placed all her faith in her. That night, when her shift finally ended, and Maren dragged herself out of the bar on aching legs, the old phone in her pocket began to vibrate, and the moment she saw the hospital's number glowing on the screen, her heart seemed to drop straight through her chest. She answered at once, and the nurse on the other end told her that Nell had suffered another episode of shortness of breath around midnight. The girl was stable now, but the doctor wanted to speak with her, and those few words were enough to strip away all the weariness of the night and leave behind nothing but naked fear. She ran toward the hospital even though there were no buses left, walking through several empty blocks, before finally gritting her teeth and ordering a car she knew she couldn't afford. And when she arrived and sat across from the doctor in a room washed in cold white light, he spoke gently but without softening the truth. Nell's heart was weakening faster than expected. The surgery could no longer be delayed. The cost was so high that when he said the number aloud, Maren heard only a ringing in her ears and felt the entire world slip beyond her reach. She sat there with both hands locked together in her lap to hide their trembling, forcing herself to nod, forcing herself to thank the doctor, forcing herself to look like an adult capable of carrying all of this, while inside she was screaming in despair, because she knew that no matter how many nights she worked without sleep, no matter how little she ate, or how long she went without buying anything for herself, no matter how carefully she saved every loose coin for an entire year, she would never come close to that amount. But when she entered the hospital room and saw Nell sleeping there, her small face pale beneath the dim light, her thin fingers resting weakly against the edge of the blanket, something inside Maren hardened once again. She sat beside the bed, took her sister's cold hand in her own, and silently promised that no matter what she had to sacrifice, no matter how many jobs she had to take, no matter how many more men like Sutton Vane she had to endure, she would save her sister's heart. She had no idea that fate was already pulling her toward a truth she had tried to bury, a truth that would soon come knocking at the door of her life and change everything. As time quietly passed, Maren tried to bury that rainy night deep within the darkest corner of her heart, almost convincing herself it was nothing more than a mistake that had finally faded, until her body began speaking in ways no amount of reason could deny. At first, it was only an unusual exhaustion, a heaviness that clung to her even after long hours of sleep. Then came the mornings when she woke with nausea rising into her throat, familiar scents suddenly turning unbearable, and a vague suspicion began growing inside her until she could no longer ignore it. One afternoon, after hesitating for a long time and counting the loose coins in her wallet again and again, she stopped at a small drugstore and bought a pregnancy test, hiding it inside her coat pocket as though she were concealing a secret, then returned home and waited until Nell had fallen asleep before quietly entering the bathroom and locking the door behind her. And during those endless minutes of waiting, her heart beat wildly, as though it already knew what was coming. When two red lines appeared clearly beneath the weak yellow light, Maren stood frozen, one hand gripping the edge of the sink, and for a moment the entire world seemed to stop turning, because she understood at once what it meant, and a wave of icy panic spread through her body. She slid down onto the cold tile floor, covered her face with both hands, and every emotion she had held back over the past several weeks broke loose at once. Fear, shame, despair, because she was carrying the child of a man whose name she didn't even know, a stranger she would never see again. While she could barely care for herself or for the little sister who needed a surgery she had no money to pay for, she thought of the burdens already crushing her, the endless nights clearing tables, the debt she owed Sutton Vane, Nell's weakening heart, and in one fragile moment, she wondered whether she had the strength to carry another life as well. But when her crying finally quieted, and she sat there in the stillness, one hand drifted unconsciously to her stomach, and something strangely tender began to rise inside her chest. Something stronger than fear. This baby hadn't done anything wrong, she thought. It hadn't asked to be born into circumstances like these. And just like Nell, it was her blood, a part of her, and Maren understood that even if the entire world turned its back on her, she would never turn her back on a child, because she knew far too well what it felt like to be abandoned. In that very moment, sitting on the bathroom floor with tears still wet upon her cheeks, Maren quietly made a decision she would never regret. She would keep the baby. She would find a way. She would carry every burden as she always had, because that was who she was. A woman life could knock down again and again, but who would never release her hold on those who belonged to her. Yet the weight of a secret so great couldn't remain hidden inside her forever. And several days later, when she could no longer bear the loneliness pressing down upon her, Maren went to the only person she could still call a friend, Del Marsh, the girl who had grown up beside her in the poor boarding house of their childhood, the girl who had once shared half a piece of bread with her on the days Maren's family had nothing left to eat, the girl who had stood beside her through the darkest years of her youth. Del looked very different now, more carefully dressed, more perfectly made up, working as a receptionist at an exclusive nightclub in the city. And every time Maren saw her, she could still recognize in her friend's eyes a fierce hunger to escape the life they had known, something Maren believed was understandable in a person who had experienced poverty in its cruelest form. They agreed to meet at a small cafe, and seated across from her old friend, Maren finally allowed the tears to fall. She told Del everything, about the rainy night, about the mysterious stranger, about the 2 red lines on the test, and about her decision to keep her baby. And throughout the entire story, Del listened in silence, holding her hand and occasionally squeezing it gently in reassurance. "You're not alone, Maren," Del said softly, her eyes shining as though she might cry with her. "We've made it through so much together. We'll make it through this too. Just stay calm. Everything will work out. I'm here." Those words settled over Maren's trembling heart like a warm blanket, and she began to cry with relief, because for the first time in so long, she felt that she didn't have to carry everything alone. She embraced Del and whispered her thanks, silently grateful to fate that in the middle of such a cold world, she still had one true friend beside her. She believed it with her whole heart, believing that their friendship of more than 20 years was the strongest and safest thing she possessed. But Maren didn't see. In the moment when she buried her face against her friend's shoulder and wept, the brief look that passed through Del's eyes, something calculating and distant when she heard the details about the mysterious, wealthy man and that fateful night, the first flicker of a thought beginning to take shape, and Maren had no idea that the absolute trust she had just placed in her closest friend would soon become the first crack leading toward the most devastating storms of her life. Long before Maren realized the new life growing inside her, the gears of destiny had already begun turning elsewhere in the city, moving relentlessly in a direction no one could have foreseen. Booker, Rourke Halloran's quiet right-hand man, had spent several days following even the smallest traces, from the blurred security footage captured around the hotel district on that rain-swept night to the fragmented account of a guard who vaguely remembered seeing a young woman rush inside, soaked to the skin, then slip away quietly in the early morning. And little by little, all those scattered pieces led him toward a bar in the old part of the city, the very place where Maren worked each night. He entered the bar late one afternoon, while it was still nearly empty, dressed in a perfectly tailored dark suit, walking with a calm composure that carried enough authority to make anyone who saw him instinctively cautious. And he went directly to the counter, placed several bills on the polished wood as an introduction that was both courteous and unmistakably suggestive, then asked in a deep, measured voice whether anyone knew a woman who had been near the hotel district during the heavy storm the previous week, a young woman who might work somewhere in the neighborhood. The bartender behind the counter frowned and shook his head as though he knew nothing, and several other employees merely shrugged, because Maren's hours were entirely different from the daytime shift, and few people paid any attention to the quiet woman who cleared tables and always kept her distance from everyone. But Booker wasn't in a hurry. He simply nodded, left a telephone number and a message saying that anyone who remembered something should contact him and would be rewarded generously, then departed as silently and mysteriously as he had arrived. What neither Booker nor anyone else in the bar noticed was that Del Marsh stood hidden in a dim corner near the entrance to the employees' area, still holding the handbag she had carried when she stopped by to invite Maren to dinner, only to find that she wasn't there, and Del had heard the entire conversation from beginning to end. At first, she was only mildly curious, but when she realized that the elegant stranger was searching relentlessly for a woman who had been in the hotel district on the very rainy night Maren would later tell her about, a delicate thread began connecting itself inside her mind, and what made her heart beat even faster was the sight that greeted her when she discreetly followed Booker toward the door and watched him climb into an expensive luxury car with a private driver. A car she recognized immediately because she had seen it parked outside the nightclub where she worked as a receptionist. Dell knew exactly who that car belonged to. She had seen the man who sat inside it before, a tall and powerful figure whom every employee at the nightclub referred to in hushed voices filled with both fear and reverence. Rourke Halloran, a name that carried the force of a warning throughout the city's underworld. The man who controlled an entire network of power stretching from the harbor to the most extravagant nightclubs. A man whose single nod could make someone wealthy or make them disappear. For one suspended moment, standing motionless on the sidewalk as she watched the car vanish into the traffic, Dell felt as though the world had opened a door before her that she had never dared to dream existed, because she understood that the mysterious wealthy man from Marin's story, the stranger in the hotel room on that rainy night, was none other than Rourke Halloran, the most powerful crime lord in the city, and now his own men were searching everywhere for the woman who had been with him that night. A vague thought took shape inside Dell's mind, no more than a brief flash at first, appearing and vanishing in an instant, but the longer she stood there thinking, the larger it became, the clearer it grew, and the more seductive it felt, and something appeared in her eyes that would have made Marin shudder had she seen it, a cold calculation mingled with the burning hunger of a woman who had grown exhausted by poverty and was ready to seize any opportunity that might transform her life. She thought of the miserable apartment she rented, of her meager wages, of all the years she had endured the contemptuous eyes of others with her teeth clenched, and then she thought of everything the Halloran name could offer: wealth, power, status, the kind of life she had always believed she deserved. And the line between friendship and ambition began to blur inside her in a dangerously quiet way. Dell didn't tell Marin a single word about what she had overheard, nor did she mention that Booker was searching for someone. She kept everything to herself as though guarding a precious jewel she had just discovered. And during the 2 weeks that followed, when Marin came to her in tears and confided in her about the pregnancy and the mysterious stranger, Dell listened with the expression of a loyal friend, while inwardly fitting together the final pieces of a plan she still didn't dare name, fully aware that the only person in the world who knew the truth about that night, the one person capable of destroying everything she was beginning to imagine, was the very friend who trusted her more deeply than anyone else. The journey of the Silver Halloran family crest proved far more winding than anyone could have imagined, and it all began on that fateful rainy night, when amid the chaos of Marin's escape and the mysterious man staggering under the effects of the drug, no one noticed that the small chain had slipped from Rourke's neck and fallen somewhere along the stone path leading away from the hotel grounds. Early the following morning, before the sky had fully brightened, Sutton Vane happened to pass along that very road while returning from a shadowy meeting of his own, and his sharp eyes, always searching for anything of value, caught the glimmer of silver beneath a shallow pool of rainwater near the curb. He bent down and picked it up, turning it over in his palm, and though he didn't know exactly who it belonged to, he recognized at once that it was no ordinary object. The silver had weight, the engravings of the ancient crest were intricate, and everything about it carried the unmistakable scent of wealth and power. So he quietly slipped it into his coat pocket like a gift dropped into his path by fortune itself, never imagining that what he had just found was the sacred symbol of the most dangerous man in the city. For several days, the crest lay untouched inside a drawer in Sutton's office. Knowing exactly how dangerous and valuable the crest was, Sutton kept it hidden from his allies in the rival faction, intending to use it as his ultimate blackmail chip if things ever turned sour. However, when his urgent gambling debts threatened his life, and Del Marsh, who had caught wind of his secret dealings, shrewdly pressed him for repayment, Sutton was backed into a corner. Driven by desperation, he handed the silver crest over to Del as temporary collateral for a massive loan, convincing himself he could buy it back before anyone noticed, while boasting that the rare piece was worth a small fortune. Del took the crest and ran her fingers over its unfamiliar markings, and at first she regarded it as nothing more than a beautiful piece of jewelry that had happened to fall into her hands. She had no idea that the small object resting in her palm was the final piece, the fateful fragment that would bring every image in her mind together and transform them into a complete plan. For not long afterward, when Marin came to her in tears and told her about the rainy night, the wealthy stranger in the hotel room, and when Del had already seen Booker searching everywhere for the woman from that night before climbing into Rourke Halloran's car, all the scattered fragments suddenly locked together inside her mind with a clarity so perfect it was almost chilling. She sat alone in her cramped apartment with the crest resting in her palm beneath the lamplight, and for the first time she looked at it with entirely different eyes. It was no longer jewelry. It was a key, a key that could open the door to fortune, status, and the life she had always longed for. Because she understood that if it truly belonged to Rourke Halloran, if it was the very object his men were desperately trying to recover, then anyone who possessed it and knew how to tell a convincing enough story could place herself in the role of the mysterious woman from that night. The bold and merciless idea sent Del's heart racing, and she knew she alone possessed every piece she needed. She knew what had happened that night through Marin's own confession. She held the very proof Rourke was seeking. Most importantly, she knew that Marin, the real woman from that night, was only a poor, timid girl with no power to fight for anything, a trusting friend who had placed her deepest secret in Del's hands without the slightest suspicion. Inside Del, the last boundary between friendship and greed faded, then vanished completely. She told herself this was the kind of opportunity that came only once in a lifetime, that Marin would never dare dream of standing beside a man like Rourke Halloran anyway, that if she didn't seize it, the chance would simply disappear for nothing, and she began constructing a story in her mind, a role, an identity she would put on like a carefully tailored dress, turning herself into the mysterious woman from the rain-soaked hotel room, into the mother carrying Halloran blood whom Rourke was searching for. She closed her fingers tightly around the crest, and in the darkness of the small apartment, a cold smile slowly appeared on her lips, because her decision had already been made. She would steal this stroke of fortune at any cost. She would impersonate, deceive, and enter the world of the powerful by using the most painful secret of the closest friend who had trusted her, and she didn't care that in order to climb to the heights she craved, she would have to trample upon the fate of the only person in the world who had ever truly loved her. Del had prepared for this moment for days, rehearsing every sentence before the mirror, refining every expression until it looked completely natural. And when she finally felt ready, she contacted the telephone number Booker had left at the bar that day and said she had information about the woman from the rainy night whom Halloran's men had been searching for. The meeting was arranged at a discreet location, and when Del walked in, she had made herself look as polished as possible, dressed elegantly while deliberately adding just enough nervous hesitation to resemble a woman carrying a secret too difficult to confess. And as she sat across from Booker beneath his sharp, searching gaze, she drew a deep breath and began performing the most important role of her life. She said that she was the woman who had been in the hotel room that night, that she hadn't known who the man was until later, that neither of them had been fully aware of what they were doing, and everything had happened unintentionally, and her voice trembled just enough, her eyes reddened just enough, to create the image of a young woman filled with shame and fear, struggling to summon the courage to reveal the truth. Booker sat in silence and listened, his face betraying no emotion, and when she had finished, he asked only a few questions in a voice that was calm yet sharp as a blade, asking what she remembered about the room, about the man, and about details only someone who had truly been there that night could have known. Del had wisely prepared for those questions. She used every detail Marin had unknowingly revealed while confiding in her: the warmth of the room, the faint scent of polished wood and expensive soap, the rain striking the windows, the man's unsteady condition, and she skillfully wove each fragment into her story so smoothly that it was almost impossible to challenge. Then, as though placing the full weight of her deception into one final blow, Del slowly opened her handbag, removed a small piece of velvet, and unfolded it to reveal the silver family crest gleaming beneath the light. She placed it on the table before Booker and said quietly that in the panic of that night she had accidentally taken it with her, and that she had kept it safe all this time because she hadn't known who it belonged to or how to return it, until she learned that people were searching for her. The moment the crest appeared, something shifted briefly in Booker's eyes, because he recognized it at once as Rourke's, the very object the entire organization had spent days searching for, and its presence in this woman's hands was powerful evidence that couldn't easily be dismissed. But Booker wasn't a man easily deceived. Nearly 10 years in the underworld had taught him that the most dangerous stories were often the ones told too smoothly, and there was something in the way Del presented herself, a perfection that seemed too carefully polished, tears that fell at moments that felt too precisely chosen, that stirred a faint suspicion in his instincts, though he couldn't yet give it a name. He picked up the crest and examined it closely, then looked at Del with cold eyes and asked one more question: why she had waited so long to come forward. Del answered immediately that she had been frightened, that she couldn't believe a poor woman like her could become entangled with a man so powerful, and that she had finally been forced to speak because she had just discovered she was carrying the child of the man from that night. The declaration was released at exactly the right moment. A shameless lie about a pregnancy that didn't exist. Yet it was the strongest card Dell could play, because she knew that to a family like the Hallorans, bloodlines and heirs were among the most sacred matters of all, and if she could plant in their minds even the possibility of a child carrying the family's blood, every door would begin opening before her. Booker only narrowed his eyes slightly when he heard it. He didn't say that she was telling the truth, nor did he accuse her of lying. He simply took possession of the crest, told her he would report everything to his employer and that someone would contact her, then rose and left with his usual composure. But the suspicion inside him hadn't faded. It had merely sunk deeper, waiting for the day it would rise again. When Booker brought the crest and the entire account back to Rourke, the powerful man remained silent for a long time, rolling the recovered family heirloom between his fingers, and although the evidence was now in his hand, although every detail seemed to fit, something inside him still refused to settle, because the faint face lingering in his memory of that rainy night, those frightened eyes wet with fear, didn't seem to match the polished, self-assured woman Booker had just described. He didn't rush to believe her, nor did he dismiss her at once. He simply ordered Booker to continue watching and investigating the woman named Delmarsh, keeping her within reach but recognizing nothing as truth yet, and that instinctive caution of Roark's, that vague feeling that something wasn't right, unknowingly left behind a narrow opening, a fragile thread of light through which the truth would one day find its way. While elsewhere in the city, Maren remained completely unaware that her identity and even the child growing inside her were being quietly stolen by the closest friend she had ever trusted. From the day Sutton Vane learned that Halloran's men had come to the bar searching for the woman from the rainy night, he realized something that sent a chill down his spine. If the events of that night were uncovered, and anyone traced the silver crest back to him, learned that he had found it and later used it as collateral, he would be caught in trouble far greater than any debt he had ever carried. Because Rourke Halloran wasn't a man known for forgiving those who touched what belonged to him. The more Sutton thought about it, the more uneasy he became, and all that fear began to settle around Maren, the quiet woman who cleared tables, and whom he knew was connected to that night more deeply than anyone else, the only person in the bar who might accidentally reveal the very things he wanted buried forever. A cold calculation began forming in his mind. He had to get rid of her before she could become a threat. He had to make her disappear from the sight and reach of the people who were searching. But this time he didn't resort to crude propositions or open threats as he had before. He chose something far more malicious. He would destroy her reputation and create a reason to fire her that appeared entirely legitimate, and so he quietly set a trap. One night near the end of the shift, while Maren was busy scrubbing the last row of tables as usual, Sutton discreetly opened the cash drawer, removed a substantial bundle of money, and slipped it into the worn handbag Maren always left in the corner of the staff room, doing everything with careful secrecy while no one was watching, then calmly waited for the right moment to strike. The following morning, once all the employees had gathered, he loudly announced that money was missing from the register, that it was a serious matter, and that he was therefore required to search everyone's belongings. Before the bewildered eyes of the entire staff, he walked directly to Maren's bag, reached inside, and pulled out the exact bundle of money he had planted there, holding it up for everyone to see with an expression that mixed triumph with carefully performed outrage. Maren went completely still, her entire body turning to stone. She stared at the money in his hand without understanding what was happening. Then when she realized she was being framed, she hurried to defend herself, insisting that she hadn't taken it, that she had never touched a single cent that didn't belong to her. Her voice trembled with humiliation and fear, but her words disappeared beneath the whispers and suspicious looks of her coworkers. Sutton looked at her, and beneath the stern expression he had put on, a cruel satisfaction gleamed in his eyes as he said, the evidence was undeniable, that a bar couldn't employ a thief, and that she was fired immediately, without wages, without severance, without a reference, and that if she caused any trouble, he would call the police. Maren stood in the middle of the room with both hands clenched at her sides, tears spilling beyond her control. But even in that moment of unbearable injustice and humiliation, she didn't fall to her knees and beg. She lifted her head, looked him directly in the eye, and said in a voice broken by emotion yet still unyielding that she knew she hadn't done it, that he could take away her job but could never take away the truth, and that one day he would pay for what he had just done. Then she quietly gathered the few belongings she had, pulled her bag over her shoulder beneath the searching stares around her, and walked out of the bar, with her back still straight even though her heart was breaking, because she understood that she had just lost her only source of income at the very moment she needed money more desperately than ever, with a child growing inside her and a little sister in the hospital whose heart was waiting day by day to be saved. When she reached the street and stepped into the morning cold, Maren leaned against the brick wall and finally allowed the tears to fall freely. It felt as though the entire world had joined together to push her over the edge. Sutton, the debt, the pregnancy, Nell's illness, everything crashing down upon her at once, as if determined to crush her. And for one fleeting moment, she believed she no longer had the strength to remain standing. But then she placed a hand over her stomach, closed her eyes, and drew a deep breath. She thought of Nell waiting for her at home. She thought of the small life she had promised to protect, and she knew she had no right to collapse. She wiped away her tears, straightened herself, and told herself that she had survived the darkest days before and would survive this one too. She would find another job, she would begin again, she would fight until the very end for the people she loved, and she couldn't possibly have known that the footsteps carrying her toward a new way to survive were about to lead her directly into the heart of the world, ruled by the man from that fateful rainy night, to the threshold of a place she had never dared enter, where destiny had already prepared cruel turns for her and truths beyond anything she could ever have imagined. In the days after she was unjustly fired, Maren went all across the city, knocking on one door after another in search of a new job. But everywhere she went, people shook their heads, partly because she had no letter of recommendation, and partly because the slight curve of her stomach had begun to show, making employers hesitate. And with every rejection she felt despair rise a little higher, because Nell's medicine couldn't wait, and the debt she owed Sutton was still hanging over her head. Then one afternoon, when she was almost completely exhausted, she happened to see a small notice advertising a night shift cleaning position at one of the most luxurious nightclubs in the city, a place people like her would normally never dare enter. And although she felt uneasy, she decided to try her luck one last time, because she had no other choice. When Maren stepped inside, she couldn't help feeling overwhelmed by the extravagant splendor surrounding her, the glossy walls faced with dark stone, the crystal chandeliers casting a soft golden light that felt both warm and impossibly expensive, the marble floors reflecting every passing figure, and an atmosphere that was alluring yet shadowed by something heavy and unsettling, making her shiver as though the place concealed countless secrets beneath its magnificent surface. The human resources manager who met with her was a stern, middle-aged woman who looked Maren over with an assessing gaze, asked a few brief questions about her experience and circumstances, and when Maren honestly said she needed the job more than anyone, that she was willing to work the latest hours and take on the hardest duties, perhaps it was the sincerity mixed with desperation in her eyes that moved the woman. Because in the end she nodded and hired Maren as a night cleaner, responsible for scrubbing and tidying after the nightclub closed. Maren felt such relief that she nearly burst into tears right there. She thanked the woman again and again, silently grateful that fate had finally opened even the smallest path of escape for her, and she had no idea that the glittering place where she had just been fortunate enough to find work was one of the properties controlled by Roark Halloran, the mysterious man from the hotel room on that rainy night, the father of the child growing inside her. Fate was cruelly ironic, because while Dell was somewhere outside using Maren's identity and lies to force her way into the Halloran world, Maren herself, the real woman from that night, was quietly entering that very same world through the back door, not as a lover or someone of elevated status, but merely as a hardworking shadow cleaning in the middle of the night, invisible and unnoticed by everyone. Her nights there passed in an atmosphere entirely different from the old bar. The nightclub was more elegant, but it was also colder and far more mysterious. She usually began her shift after the last guests had departed, when the music had stopped and only silence remained, echoing through the vast rooms, and she would quietly wipe each table, polish every stretch of floor, and clear away the remnants of a night of luxury she was allowed to witness only from behind the curtain. Sometimes she saw men in expensive suits moving through the darkness with cold expressions, heard whispered conversations behind half-closed doors, and felt sharp eyes following every movement around them, and her instincts told her this place wasn't merely a destination for pleasure, but also concealed dangerous things she had no business becoming curious about, so she always kept her head down and focused on her work, trying to make herself completely invisible, neither hearing nor seeing nor asking anything. Even so, despite the exhaustion and the constant need for caution, Maren remained quietly grateful for the job, because the pay was better than at the old bar, enough to cover part of Nell's medicine and kindle the faintest hope that she might begin saving for the surgery, and every night after finishing her work, she would place one hand gently over her stomach and whisper to her unborn child that she would keep trying, that no matter how difficult life became, she would take care of both the baby and the child's Aunt Nell. She didn't know that only a few walls away, sometimes only one floor above her, was the man to whom fate had bound her with an invisible thread, a man who spent his days and nights thinking about a blurred face from the rainy night, without realizing that same face was quietly cleaning the floors of his own establishment every evening, and she didn't know that the fragile distance between two strangers, who were already far closer than either understood, would soon be erased by fate, pushing them toward an encounter neither of them could possibly foresee. One night, as Maren quietly polished the row of brass railings on the nightclub's mezzanine after closing, she suddenly sensed a change in the air, the way the security staff abruptly straightened, the way the whispers faded and every gaze turned toward the main staircase, as though an invisible current had passed through the entire room. She looked up instinctively, and in that moment she saw a man descending the stairs, tall and solidly built, dressed in a perfectly tailored dark suit, moving with a slow, measured stride that carried such absolute authority that the space itself seemed to bow and make way for him. And although she had no idea who he was, Maren felt her heart begin to beat faster in a strange and unsettling way, as if something both unfamiliar and deeply familiar had awakened inside her chest. The man was Rourke Halloran, though she didn't know it, and when he reached the bottom of the staircase, his gaze swept casually across the room before stopping where she stood, a slender cleaning woman in a plain uniform with a cloth still held in her hand, and for one suspended second, time seemed to stand still between two strangers. A subtle stir of familiarity crossed Rourke's mind, a brief shadow of a memory he couldn't quite place. Yet it was sharp enough to make him hesitate. He paused for half a step, his brows drawing together slightly, his eyes lingering on her longer than they normally would, as he tried to trace the strange feeling that had risen within him, while Maren, caught beneath the sharp gaze of such a powerful man, quickly lowered her head, her heart pounding, stepped back, murmured an apology, and turned away to continue working, wanting only to become invisible again as she always had. Neither of them recognized the other, because in Rourke's memory that night existed only as a blurred veil of mist, and in Maren's fear, it remained no more than a handful of chaotic fragments she had desperately tried to forget. But the invisible thread fate had tied between them still trembled in that accidental encounter, leaving each of them with a restless feeling they couldn't name. Rourke unsettled by the fact that he cared about a cleaning woman at all, and Maren confused by the way her heart had lost its rhythm before a stranger. But that fragile moment was quickly shattered when a familiar shrill voice sounded from behind them, and when Maren turned, she froze at the sight of Dell approaching in a dazzling, expensive gown, her makeup flawless, her posture polished and aristocratic, as though she had belonged to this world of luxury all her life. For one brief instant, Maren brightened and nearly called out to her closest friend, but Dell's eyes passed over her with cold, unfamiliar indifference, and when she noticed Rourke standing nearby, something vicious flashed within them. Instead of acknowledging Maren, Dell raised her voice and hurled a stream of cruel insults, demanding to know why a filthy, ragged little girl from the slums had been allowed to wander through such an elegant place, saying that people like her only polluted the atmosphere. Maren stood motionless, as if someone had thrown ice water over her entire body. She couldn't believe those vicious words had come from the mouth of the friend she had trusted, with the deepest secret of her life, the woman who only recently had held her hand, comforted her, and promised she would always remain by her side, and the pain cut deeper than the humiliation itself, because it carried the first unmistakable wound of betrayal. Even though Maren still couldn't understand the full truth behind it, she stood there gripping the cleaning cloth with both hands, her lips trembling, tears rising but held back through sheer force of will, refusing to let herself break before everyone watching. And although her heart was splintering inside her, she lifted her head and looked directly at Dell. There was no pleading in her eyes and no accusation, only a deep sorrow and a quiet strength, and she said softly that she was only doing her job and wouldn't trouble anyone, then turned away in silence. Rourke watched the entire scene from a distance, and although he didn't say a word, a strange discomfort rose within him when he saw the cleaning woman humiliated, a vague sense of anger he couldn't explain, and didn't understand why he felt. His eyes narrowed as he followed her slender figure disappearing from view, then shifted toward the woman standing proudly before him, the woman who claimed to be carrying Halloran blood, and the instinct that something was wrong. The suspicion that had been smoldering inside him for so long rose again more powerfully than ever, though he still couldn't imagine that the truth was hidden directly before his eyes. The pressure to produce an heir for the Halloran family didn't come from Rourke, but from his mother, Thorne Halloran, the woman feared and respected throughout the city's underworld. The true power behind the curtain, who controlled every link in the chain with a cold hand that never strayed beyond the principles she had set for herself. Now, in her 60s, Thorne still carried herself with a sharp and commanding dignity, her silver hair pinned neatly in place, her cold gray eyes seeming capable of seeing straight through a person's soul. And when she learned that a woman possessed the family crest and claimed to be carrying Halloran blood, she immediately summoned her son to the estate for a conversation. In the vast drawing room, with its dark wood-paneled walls and fire crackling softly in the hearth, Thorne sat upright in an armchair, took a measured sip of tea, then told Rourke in a calm voice that allowed no argument that the time had come for the family to have a successor, that she wasn't young anymore and couldn't wait forever, and that if the woman truly carried his child, then the family had no right to deny it. Rourke stood beside the window with both hands clasped behind his back, and inside him rose a conflict he found difficult to express, because on one hand he understood his duty to the family and his mother's longing for someone to carry on the bloodline, but on the other, the uneasy instinct inside him continued to gnaw at him, the feeling that something about the woman named Del Marsh wasn't genuine, that her story flowed too smoothly to be trusted. He slowly told his mother that he didn't fully believe the woman, that certain details troubled him, that the face buried in his blurred memory of that night didn't seem to match hers, but Thorne only raised an eyebrow, set down her teacup, and replied in a cold, cutting voice that the memory of a man who had been drugged was hardly reliable, that the evidence was already in their possession, that the crest unquestionably belonged to the family, and that no one except the woman from that night could have had it. She added that in their world, people couldn't afford hesitation based on vague feelings, that an heir carrying Halloran blood was far too important to gamble with, and that if Rourke continued to delay, he was placing the future of the entire family at risk, because their enemies were always waiting for the smallest weakness they could exploit. Thorne wasn't blindly cruel. She lived by her own principles and possessed an absolute loyalty to the family. And because of that, protecting and preserving the Halloran bloodline was sacred above almost everything else in her eyes. She didn't judge the pregnant woman through emotion, but through the cold logic of someone who had always placed the family's interests above all else, and so she urged her son to acknowledge the woman quickly and formally bring the child into the household. The pressure from such a formidable mother weighed heavily on Rourke's shoulders, and although doubt still churned inside him, he was gradually forced toward compromise, because he knew that once Thorne had made up her mind, almost nothing could change it, and a part of him wanted to believe that perhaps the child was real, that perhaps after all the loss and betrayal of his past, he might finally have something that belonged to him alone. He reluctantly agreed to consider recognizing Del and arranging a proper place for her, but even as the words left his mouth, a quiet voice inside his chest resisted, the instinct forged and sharpened by years of living among danger, and he told himself that even if he agreed, he wouldn't lower his guard, that Booker would continue watching her in secret, and that he would preserve within himself the remaining doubt he couldn't erase. What was strange was that whenever Rourke thought about acknowledging Del, his mind drifted unwillingly toward the slender cleaning woman he had encountered at the nightclub that night, toward the inexplicable ache he had felt when their eyes met, toward the strange anger that had stirred in him when he saw her humiliated, and he couldn't understand why someone so distant and seemingly irrelevant continued to haunt him, slipping into his thoughts at the moments he least expected. He pushed the image aside and dismissed it as a passing distraction, but fate had always been more cunning than any human calculation, and while Rourke prepared to formally recognize a false identity woven from lies and ambition, the truth remained quietly beneath the roof of one of his own establishments, hidden behind the figure of a hard-working woman who polished the floors every night, waiting only for the right moment to ignite and overturn everything. The hidden war Rourke Halloran was facing hadn't begun on that fateful rainy night, but the events of that night had been one move in a far larger conspiracy, because the fact that he had been drugged during what appeared to be a business meeting was actually a carefully calculated test designed to make him lose control and expose his weaknesses. Behind it all was a longtime rival from the underworld, a man who had quietly coveted the Halloran family's control of the harbor for years, because that harbor was the most vital artery in Rourke's empire, the place where goods moved in and out, where streams of money flowed, and whoever controlled it could nearly control the entire balance of power in the city. In recent weeks, the rival faction had begun tightening its grip with careful precision. They quietly bought off several shipping owners, pressured partners who had remained loyal to the Hallorans, sent men to spread rumors meant to weaken the confidence of their allies, and step by step they were trying to choke the lifeblood of the harbor until Rourke was forced either to surrender or collapse. Rourke understood perfectly well that this was a war for survival, and he answered with the cold calculation and strategic cunning that had always defined him. He strengthened the security forces guarding the harbor, tightened discipline within his own ranks, and cut off every suspicious link. But what troubled him most was the growing instinct that there was a traitor among his men, an informant quietly feeding information to the enemy, because some of their moves had been so precise that coincidence was impossible. What Rourke hadn't yet discovered was that the insider was none other than Sutton Vane, the bar manager who appeared to be nothing more than an insignificant piece in a much larger picture, but who was, in truth, a pawn the rival faction had planted and bought long ago with money and promises of power. Sutton had always been greedy and constantly short of money because of his gambling debts, so when the enemy approached him and offered enormous rewards in exchange for becoming their eyes and ears, he hadn't hesitated for even a moment before selling his loyalty. He had helped arrange the trap on that rainy night, and he was also the secret channel through which information about the Halloran operations was passed to the rival faction, gathered through his shadowy contacts and discreet connections. Now that he knew Halloran's men were searching for the woman from the rainy night, and now that he could feel the trail leading back to the crest he had found beginning to tighten around him, Sutton became even more frightened and sank deeper into his crimes. He did everything he could to eliminate loose ends, trying to conceal his own involvement while continuing to serve the enemy in the hope that when the Halloran family finally fell, he would be given a share of the new power that rose in its place. The atmosphere in the underworld grew more suffocating by the day. Secret meetings took place in darkness. Warnings were delivered with chilling calm, and although there had not yet been an open and bloody confrontation, everyone could feel that a great storm was drawing near, that a single spark would be enough to ignite a full-scale war between the two powers. Rourke became more cautious with each passing day. He spent nearly sleepless nights calculating every move, ordered Booker to investigate quietly in search of the traitor, and tightened security at every one of his businesses, from the harbor to the most luxurious nightclubs. He knew that in this deadly game, even the smallest mistake could cost him everything he had spent years building. Yet amid the countless layers of conspiracy and danger closing in around him, Rourke's mind was still sometimes disturbed by matters that seemed entirely unrelated, by the doubts that remained about the woman claiming to carry his child, by the image of the quiet cleaning woman with the unwavering eyes whom he couldn't force himself to forget, and he began to sense that all these scattered fragments, the drugging on the rainy night, the missing crest, the hidden traitor, and the unexpected people entering his life, were somehow being connected by the invisible hand of fate. He still couldn't see the entire picture. He couldn't yet know how those separate threads of deception would eventually collide and explode, but the instincts of a man who had survived countless dangers told him that the moment when every secret would be exposed was drawing close, and when the storm finally broke, it would sweep everyone away, both his enemies and the people whose true meaning in his life he hadn't yet begun to understand. Late one night, after the nightclub had closed and only silence remained beneath the dim golden light spilling across rows of empty tables, Marin pushed her cleaning cart, as she always did, into the private VIP area on the upper floor, a collection of discreet rooms that stayed locked during the day and opened only for the secret meetings of the city's elite. She quietly went about her familiar work, wiping down tables, gathering glasses, and vacuuming the velvet seating. While deep cleaning the corner booth, her brush caught on something wedged deep inside the gap between the leather cushions, a folded document dropped in the hurry of a secretive departure. Marin pulled the papers out to throw them away, but as her eyes caught the written lines, she froze. The pages were covered with numbers, abbreviated names, locations around the harbor, and transportation schedules, and among them Marin suddenly recognized a name so familiar that it sent a chill through her. Sutton Vane, the former manager who had framed her, mentioned again and again as a contact, beside notes suggesting secret payments and information being passed to outsiders. Marin's heart began to pound, because although she didn't understand every detail, her instincts told her that this was something terribly dangerous, a fragment of some dark conspiracy she had no business becoming involved in, evidence that could cost someone their life, and she remembered the suffocating sense of danger she had always felt inside this place. She quickly moved to put the papers back where she had found them, telling herself that she was only a cleaning woman, that her job was to clean and not to investigate, that the less she knew, the safer she would be. But at that very moment, she heard footsteps and voices approaching from the hallway, and in her panic she had time only to fold several pages, slip them into the pocket of her apron, then lower her head and continue wiping as though nothing had happened. 2 unfamiliar men entered the room, their cold eyes sweeping over her, and one of them frowned and demanded to know what she was doing there. Maren forced herself to remain calm and answered that she was only a member of the night cleaning staff finishing her duties, then politely asked to leave and pushed her cart away, her back wet with cold sweat and the sensation of countless eyes following every step she took. When she reached the deserted corner of the changing room, Maren pulled out the pages with trembling hands and examined them again. And the more she read, the more frightened she became, because she began to understand that the documents were connected to some hidden struggle. To Sutton's betrayal, to powers so dangerous that merely touching them could make someone as insignificant as her vanish without a trace. And now she had accidentally become the keeper of a deadly secret. She faced a merciless choice. Part of her wanted to throw the papers far away and pretend she had never seen them, to protect her own life, the child inside her, and Nell. But another part of her conscience whispered that this evidence might expose Sutton's crimes, that the man who had destroyed her might have harmed many others as well, and that if she turned away, evil would be allowed to continue untouched. She didn't know what to do. She only knew that she was trapped in a situation of terrible danger, because those pages made her a threat to both sides, to the rival faction plotting to seize control of the harbor and to Sutton himself, men who would never allow a witness who knew too much to remain free. And she understood that from the moment she picked up those documents, her life had been pushed into a circle of danger she couldn't begin to measure. That night, Maren hid the pages carefully inside the lining of her handbag and carried them home with a heavy heart. And when she looked at Nell sleeping peacefully and placed one hand unconsciously over her stomach, the burden on her shoulders seemed to grow 1,000 times heavier, because now she wasn't only struggling with poverty and illness, but also carrying a secret that could take everything from her. She lay awake through the entire night, her thoughts spinning between fear and guilt, wondering whether she should find some way to tell someone trustworthy. Yet she didn't know whom she could trust in this unfamiliar and merciless world, and she couldn't have imagined that the fateful pages she had accidentally found would soon become the crucial link connecting her destiny to the powerful man who was searching day and night for the traitor within his ranks. In the darkness of the cramped room, Maren clutched the blanket tightly and told herself that whatever happened, she had to be careful, that she had to protect the people she loved, never realizing that danger was already closer than she believed, that the men in the shadows had begun watching the cleaning woman who knew too much, and that the storm of fate she had always sensed was about to drag her into its very center, where every secret, every lie, and every truth would finally collide. As the weeks wore on and the new life inside her continued to grow, Maren's body began to feel heavier, forcing her to rely on sheer willpower to finish each grueling night shift, until the disaster she had always feared finally struck on a cold early morning just after she returned home. She had barely opened the door when she heard a weak, ragged wheezing from the sofa, and when she rushed over, her heart seemed to stop at the sight of Nell curled into herself, her face frighteningly pale, her lips turning blue. One small hand pressed against her chest as though she were trying to hold on to each breath slipping away. Maren gathered her sister into her arms in panic, calling the girl's name through her tears, then frantically called an ambulance and held Nell tightly throughout the journey to the hospital, whispering over and over that she was there, that Nell had to keep fighting, that she had to stay with her, while Maren's heart shattered with helplessness as she watched her sister struggle against the pain. At the hospital, after endless minutes spent waiting in the corridor with both trembling hands locked together, the doctor finally emerged with a grave expression and told Maren that Nell's heart had weakened to a critical point, that the child couldn't wait any longer, and that the surgery had to be performed as soon as possible, or her life would be in danger with every passing day. The words struck Maren like a blade driven straight through her heart, and when he repeated the enormous cost of the operation and the deposit that had to be paid before the hospital could schedule the urgent procedure, the entire world seemed to spin around her, because the amount was so far beyond anything she could possibly manage, that even if she gathered every small wage she had saved, even if she sold everything she owned, it still wouldn't come close. She stood motionless in the cold, white hospital corridor, one hand resting over the child growing inside her, and the other gripping the edge of a chair to keep herself from collapsing. And for the first time after so many hardships, she felt that she had truly reached the bottom of despair, because the life of the only sister she loved more than herself was hanging in the balance simply because she didn't have enough money. In the days that followed, Maren searched everywhere for help. She went to every acquaintance she had and asked to borrow money. She went to the bank and begged for a loan, only to be refused because she had nothing to offer as collateral. She even forced herself to consider choices she had never before allowed into her mind, but every door slammed shut in her face, and each time she returned, defeated, and saw Nell lying unconscious in the hospital bed, surrounded by tubes and wires attached to her frail body. Maren's heart twisted with fresh pain. There were nights when she sat beside her sister's bed, holding the girl's cold hand and crying in silence, and Nell, weak as she was, would still force open her exhausted eyes and whisper, "Maren, if it costs too much, then let it go. I'm all right. I don't want you to suffer any more because of me." Those resigned words from a child only 12 years old hurt Maren more deeply than anything else. She pulled Nell into her arms, pressed her face into the girl's soft hair, and sobbed as she told her never to say such a thing again, that she would find a way, that she would never give up and would never allow herself to lose her. In those darkest hours, Maren thought of everything she had endured, of their late mother, who had once told her always to protect her sister, of the promise she had made in her own heart that she would remain Nell's shelter no matter what happened, and she knew she couldn't, mustn't, allow herself to fall now. Even though both her body and soul had been drained beyond exhaustion, she wiped away her tears, rose from the hospital chair, and in her eyes returned the familiar strength that had carried her through so many storms. She told herself that as long as there was still the faintest chance, she would keep fighting, that as long as she could still draw breath, she wouldn't stop, and she began considering every path that remained, even those she knew were filled with danger. It was in that moment of absolute desperation that her thoughts briefly turned to the place where she worked, to the wealth and luxury radiating from every corner of the nightclub, and even to the secret documents she had hidden away, though she immediately pushed aside the reckless ideas beginning to form, because she understood that touching the underworld was no different from playing with fire. But fate had never followed the careful plans of human beings, and while Maren struggled alone at the edge of pain and hopelessness, she had no idea that the invisible threads of destiny were tightening around her with every passing moment, that the friend who had betrayed her was living in fear of her existence, that the powerful man who was the father of the child she carried still hadn't silenced his doubts, and that all those separate paths of fate were about to collide, pulling her toward the cruelest turning point of her life, yet perhaps also toward the final fragile hope that could save her little sister's heart. As the moment drew closer for Roark to formally acknowledge Dell's status, she became increasingly uneasy, because she understood that the greatest threat to the entire structure of lies she had built wasn't anyone's suspicion, but Maren's very existence, the real woman from the rainy night, the only person in the world who possessed the truth capable of destroying everything Dell had worked so carefully to create. Dell knew that Maren was working as a cleaner inside Rock's own nightclub, and that knowledge kept her awake night after night, because it would take only one accidental moment, only one instant in which Maren and Roark truly recognized each other, for everything to collapse, and that fear slowly drove Dell toward a merciless decision she might once have been too afraid even to imagine. She decided that Maren had to disappear from the picture, and she began forming a cold and deliberate plan. She would stage an accident to eliminate her old friend, disguising it as an unfortunate incident so that no one could ever trace it back to her. Dell secretly hired a man from the shadows, a driver willing to do anything for money, and arranged for him to wait on the night Maren finished her shift and walked home alone along a deserted road, intending for him to strike her in the darkness when traffic was sparse, making the whole thing appear to be nothing more than a random hit-and-run. What Dell didn't know was that throughout all this time, Booker, Roark's right-hand man, had continued watching her in secret under his employer's orders, because the suspicion stirred by the unnatural smoothness of Dell's story had never truly faded from his mind, and it was both his professional caution and the rare sense of morality still alive within him that kept him alert to every unusual move she made. On that fateful night, when Booker followed Dell quietly and discovered that she had been meeting in secret with an unfamiliar man, while a car waited concealed in darkness near Maren's usual route, a grim instinct rose inside him at once, and when he placed the fragments together, he suddenly understood that a deadly plan was about to be carried out against the cleaning woman who had already drawn Roark's attention. There was no time to warn anyone. Booker immediately accelerated after them, his heart pounding as he saw Maren's small figure in the distance, walking quietly along the sidewalk of the empty road, and at that same moment, the hired driver's car suddenly roared to life behind her and surged forward at a terrifying speed, slicing through the darkness like an arrow aimed directly at her. In that breathless instant when everything hung by a thread, Booker had no time to think. He wrenched the wheel and drove his own car across the road to block the path, shouting for Marin to move, and the roar of engines and the scream of brakes tore through the silence of the night. The attacker's car swerved violently to avoid the unexpected obstruction, lost control, and veered away, while Marin, reacting in blind panic, fell hard onto the roadside. Everything happened within only a few brief seconds. Realizing the plan had failed, the hired driver slammed down on the accelerator and vanished into the darkness, leaving Booker to rush toward Marin, who lay curled on the ground with her face drained of color, one hand instinctively wrapped around her pregnant belly, her eyes wide with terror as she struggled to understand what had just happened. Booker dropped to his knees beside her and asked urgently whether she was hurt, and when he saw that she was still conscious but trembling in pain, he didn't hesitate for another second. He carefully helped her up, guided her into his car, and drove at once toward the nearest hospital, reassuring her again and again that she would be all right, that he was taking her somewhere safe. Inside Booker, a storm was raging, because he had just saved a human life from an attempted murder, and more importantly, he had just witnessed the clearest proof yet that the woman named Del Marsh, whom he had distrusted from the beginning, was truly dangerous and deceitful, someone willing to kill in order to protect the false identity she had stolen. And that knowledge confirmed that his instincts had been right all along. He looked at Marin lying across the seat, one hand still protecting the child inside her even while she herself was in pain, and something stirred in the hardened heart of a man who had witnessed countless crimes in the underworld, because he recognized in this small woman a fierce resilience and the instinct of a mother, and in silence he decided that he had to protect her, that he had to bring the truth into the light. As the car raced through the night streets toward the hospital, Booker pulled out his phone, and after a brief hesitation, he called Rourke, because he knew the time had come for his employer to learn everything, to learn about the murderous plot that had just been stopped, and about the mysterious woman whom fate had once again placed directly in their path, and he couldn't possibly have known that this single call was about to open the door to the truth they had all been searching for so long. At the hospital, Booker brought Marin into the emergency room and waited outside with an expression of tension rarely seen on his face, while the doctors and nurses quickly examined her condition, and after a stretch of waiting that seemed to last forever, the doctor finally emerged and announced that the young woman was out of danger, having suffered only a few bruises and minor scrapes from the fall, while her overall condition had stabilized. Then he added something that made Booker go still, revealing that the young woman was pregnant, and that miraculously, the unborn child remained unharmed despite the trauma the mother had just endured, though she would need rest and must avoid any further physical impact or emotional strain in the days ahead. Booker stood motionless when he heard the news, because his mind immediately returned to Del's claim that she was pregnant, and a terrible suspicion began taking shape more clearly than ever before. A possibility he had sensed only vaguely until now, that the real woman from the rainy night, the one truly carrying the blood the Halloran family had been searching for, might not be Del at all, but the small cleaning woman lying in the room beyond that door. Not long afterward, the hurried sound of footsteps echoed from the far end of the corridor, and Rourke Halloran appeared with a cold expression that still betrayed an unusual urgency, because Booker's call in the middle of the night, along with his few stark words about an attempted murder and a mysterious woman, had made it impossible for him to remain where he was. He strode toward Booker and demanded to know what had happened, and Booker, wearing a seriousness Rourke had never seen before, gave him a brief account of everything: how he had discovered that Del had secretly hired someone to stage an accident, how he had intervened in time and saved the woman, and how that woman was the cleaning employee from the nightclub, whom the doctor had just confirmed was 4 months pregnant. Every word Booker spoke struck like a hammer against the wall of doubt Rourke had built inside himself, and he stood frozen as his eyes darkened and the scattered pieces in his mind began fitting themselves together. The blurred rainy night, the face of a woman soaked through by the storm that he had never been able to forget, the suspicious perfection of Del's story, and now a woman pregnant at exactly the right time, the very woman Del had tried to kill. As though driven forward by an invisible force, Rourke slowly approached the hospital room, pushed open the door, and when his eyes fell upon the woman lying beneath the soft, pale light, the entire world around him seemed to stop. It was that face, the face that had haunted him through countless nights, the eyes he had glimpsed at the nightclub and felt that inexplicable ache within his chest. And now, seeing her clearly beneath the light, the blurred memories of the rainy night came rushing back with sudden force. The gentle fragrance that had seemed so out of place, the frightened eyes drenched with rain, the sense of familiarity he hadn't been able to name, all of it becoming vivid and clear enough to tighten his heart. Maren, still shaken from the terror she had endured, and not yet fully recovered from the shock, looked up at the man who had just entered, and when she recognized him as the powerful figure she had briefly encountered at the nightclub, the man whose authority had made her tremble, she drew farther into herself in confusion and fear. But when their eyes truly met, something deep inside her also stirred, a faint sense of familiarity she couldn't explain. In that moment, neither of them spoke. Yet both could feel the invisible thread fate had bound between them on that fateful night, pulling tighter than ever before. And Rourke, the cold and powerful man who had always controlled every emotion, felt his chest falter for the first time beneath the weight of a truth so unexpected that he had only... He looked at the small woman lying there with the quiet curve of pregnancy beneath the blanket, looked into her eyes where fear, exhaustion, and the same unyielding strength he had noticed before were woven together, and only one question remained in his mind, urgent and relentless: whether this was truly the woman from the rainy night, whether the child she carried was really his, and whether everything Dell had told him had been nothing but lies. Rourke drew a deep breath and fought to contain the storm rising inside him. Then, in a low, rough voice unlike his usual cold tone, he softly asked her name, and when Maren answered with a tremble, giving him a name that was unfamiliar yet felt like the final missing piece, he knew that his life and all the secrets buried for so long were about to turn onto an entirely new path, one where every lie would finally be exposed beneath the light, and the truth would at last reclaim the place that belonged to it. The moment Rourke learned her name, and saw with his own eyes that she was pregnant at exactly the right time, he couldn't wait any longer, and although the doctor had instructed her to rest, he spoke as gently as he possibly could, and asked her about that rainy night, about what had truly happened inside the hotel room. At first, Maren was hesitant and frightened. She didn't understand why this powerful stranger cared about her story, but when she looked into his eyes no longer cold but filled with something urgent and wounded, she gathered every ounce of courage she possessed, and finally spoke the truth she had buried for so many months. She told him that she had only been fleeing from danger that night, that she had taken shelter in the room while overwhelmed by panic, that neither of them had been fully conscious of what they were doing, and that the following morning she had slipped away in shame without taking anything at all, her voice trembling yet so sincere that it was almost impossible to doubt her. Rourke listened to every word, his heart beating faster with each passing moment, and then he asked the most important question, the question upon which Dell's entire web of lies had been built. He asked whether she had seen or taken a silver family crest that night, a chain engraved with the Halloran emblem that he had always worn around his neck. Maren shook her head in confusion. She said she had never seen any crest, that she had no idea what he was talking about, that when she left she had taken only the few belongings that were hers and hadn't touched a single thing in the room, because her self-respect would never allow her to do such a thing no matter how poor she was. Her honest bewilderment struck like lightning through the last remaining veil that had concealed the truth, because in that instant Rourke suddenly understood the heart of the deception. If the real woman from that night had never even seen the crest, then how could Dell have produced that very object as proof that she had been in the room? Dell's entire story collapsed at its most essential point. Every broken fragment in Rourke's mind finally locked into place, forming a complete and chilling picture. He understood that Dell had never been there that night, that she had somehow obtained the crest and constructed the entire story around it, that the pregnancy she claimed was nothing more than a shameless lie, and that the real woman, the one truly carrying his blood, was the small and resilient cleaning woman lying before him, the very person Dell had just tried to murder. A cold fury rose inside Rourke as he thought of everything Dell had done, the brazen lies, the stolen identity, and most cruelly of all, the attempt to kill in order to silence the truth. But what hurt him more deeply was the realization, as he looked at Maren, of how much undeserved suffering this innocent woman had endured because of another person's greed. He quietly asked her about the person who had harmed her, and Maren, beginning to trust him a little more, tearfully told him about Dell, the childhood friend in whom she had placed absolute faith, the woman to whom she had confessed every secret from that night. Through her tears, she said she didn't understand why Dell had recently become so cold and vicious toward her. She still had no idea that the same friend had stolen her identity. When Rourke heard this, he closed his eyes for a brief moment, because now everything was completely clear, and he felt both rage and sorrow. Rage at Dell's betrayal and cruelty, and sorrow for the woman before him, who had been stabbed in the back by the person she trusted most, without even knowing it. He looked at Maren with an entirely different expression now, one softened by tenderness and guilt, then told her in a low and unwavering voice that she should rest and protect her health, that from this moment forward no one would ever be allowed to harm her or the baby again, that he would personally protect them both, and that he would make certain every person responsible for all this suffering paid the price they deserved. Maren stared at him in astonishment, still unable to understand the full meaning of his words, or the true connection between them, but for the first time after so many months of loneliness and despair, the faintest sense of safety began to kindle inside her, and her eyes stung with something very close to relief. Rourke rose to his feet, his gaze returning to its familiar cold sharpness, though now it carried an even more ruthless determination than before. He turned toward Booker, who stood silently by the door, and ordered him in a quiet but steely voice to prepare everything, because the time had come to bring this entire performance of lies to an end, and he left the hospital room with the decisive stride of a man who had finally reclaimed the truth and was ready to demand justice for the woman who had suffered far too much. Not long after the full truth came to light, Dell learned that Maren was in the hospital and that Rourke had gone there, and a wave of absolute panic rose inside her, because she understood that if the two of them were allowed to remain together any longer, every secret she had hidden would be exposed. So she rushed to the hospital in a state of frantic desperation, determined to make one final reckless attempt to preserve the identity she had stolen. She stormed into the corridor without caring about the stares of those around her, shouting Rourke's name, and when she saw him standing outside Maren's room, she immediately rushed toward him and slipped into the role of a wounded woman, tears filling her eyes as she shrieked that Maren was a shameless seductress who had lured him away, that she was manipulating him to steal the place that rightfully belonged to Dell, that Dell was the true woman from that night and the mother of his child. But this time Rourke wasn't moved by the familiar performance. His face remained cold as ice, and while Dell continued to sob and cry out, he cut her off in a calm, deep voice sharpened like a blade, telling her that if she was truly carrying his child, then she would come with him to see a doctor and have the pregnancy confirmed at once, immediately, that very day. The demand struck Dell like a bucket of freezing water thrown into her face. She went completely still, her skin draining of color, and the false tears dried almost instantly. She began stammering excuses, grasping at one reason after another, her voice shaking as she demanded to know why he was humiliating her. But Rourke showed no mercy. He looked directly into her eyes and said he was tired of lies, that the time had come for everything to be brought into the light. Cornered with nowhere left to turn, Dell's gaze darted wildly in search of an escape, but when Rourke gave a slight signal and Booker stepped forward carrying a bag containing the silver crest along with evidence of the staged accident, Dell understood that there was no longer any way to deny what she had done, and the wall of deception she had built so carefully finally collapsed in its entirety. In the moment she was exposed, the fragile and pitiful mask Dell had worn disappeared, replaced by bitterness and madness etched openly across her face. She laughed harshly, then snarled that yes, she had taken the crest. Yes, she had invented the entire story, and when Maren heard the commotion and struggled upright to look out from her hospital room with eyes filled with tears and disbelief, Dell turned toward her old friend with a gaze burning with both hatred and despair. She shouted out everything she had kept buried inside, saying that she had grown sick of poverty, sick of living a small and miserable life, and that when a chance to escape had fallen into her hands, she couldn't simply let it go. Then she gave a bitter, cruel laugh, and demanded to know whether friendship had ever fed anyone, whether friendship could provide wealth and status, or whether it offered nothing but years of shared suffering. And in those words, the full corruption of a person who had once known how to love was laid bare. Maren listened in stunned silence, her heart breaking beyond measure, as she realized that the closest friend she had ever trusted had betrayed her with such cruelty, had stolen her identity, and had even tried to take both her life and the life of her unborn child. And all she could do was look at Dell through tear-filled eyes carrying both profound disappointment and sorrow for a friendship that had died. Dell still refused to stop. She lunged toward Maren's hospital room with hatred twisting her face, but the security guards immediately seized her, and at that very moment the police officers Rourke had summoned arrived, because he had decided that this time he wouldn't settle matters according to the brutal rules of the underworld, but would allow the law to speak. Dell was dragged away, screaming and struggling, still hurling vicious words, but her voice no longer carried any power, only the despair of someone who had destroyed everything through her own greed, and she was arrested on a series of charges including theft, fraud, and conspiracy to commit murder. But Rourke didn't stop there. He was prepared to remove every trace of corruption. He turned over to the authorities all the evidence of Sutton Vane's betrayal, along with the documents exposing the rival faction's plan to seize control of the harbor, including the crucial pages Marin had accidentally found and preserved, which became the decisive link that helped uncover the entire conspiracy. Sutton Vane and the leaders of the rival organization were arrested one after another through the proper legal process and charged with serious crimes. And for the first time after years of living in darkness, Rourke Halloran chose to step into the light, using open justice instead of hidden violence to punish evil, a decision that marked a profound change within him, inspired by the woman and the child he now wished to protect. When everything had finally quieted and the hospital corridor returned to silence, Rourke went back into Marin's room, where she was still crying softly, and he stood there looking at her with tenderness and regret, because he knew the road ahead would be long if he hoped to make amends for everything she had suffered. But at least the truth had finally been revealed, justice had been served, and the resilient woman before him would no longer have to face every storm alone. After all the storms had passed, Rourke personally arranged for Nell to be transferred to the finest hospital in the city and placed under the care of its leading physicians, and the heart surgery Marin had once believed would forever remain beyond her reach finally became a reality, not as a grand display of charity, but as a quiet and sincere act of care. During the long hours outside the operating room, Marin held her hands tightly together and prayed without ceasing, and when the doors finally opened and the doctors announced that the operation had been a complete success, that Nell's little heart could now beat with healthy, steady strength, Marin burst into tears of happiness and embraced her recovering sister as though the entire world had been given back to her. After learning the full truth about Dell's lies, Thorne Halloran came to visit Marin in person, and when that cold and powerful woman saw the small young woman who had endured so much suffering alone, yet never surrendered her dignity, she couldn't hide her admiration. She took Marin's hand and spoke in a voice softened of its usual sharpness, saying that Marin had suffered far more than anyone should have to bear, and that she sincerely welcomed both her and her unborn grandchild, not because of blood or status, but because of the woman Marin truly was, because of the goodness and strength she had proven through every hardship. Marin accepted her words with deep emotion, but she also gently explained that she had never longed for wealth, that all she had ever wanted was to be treated as a person of value, to live honestly beside those she loved, and that quiet honesty only deepened Thorne's respect for her. Not long afterward, when every storm had settled and Nell had recovered, Rourke took Marin to a peaceful place, and there he bowed his head and sincerely apologized for all the suffering and injustice she had endured, apologizing for not recognizing the truth sooner and for failing to protect her when she needed him most. He told her that what he valued most wasn't anything she possessed, but her soul, her resilience, her self-respect, and the compassionate heart she had never lost even in the most desperate circumstances, and that he hoped to remain beside her, to raise their child with her and protect Nell as well, not as a benefactor offering charity, but as a life partner who would honor, respect, and love her. Then he slowly lowered himself onto one knee, and the eyes of a man who had once been cold toward the entire world had become strangely gentle as he asked her to marry him, promising to spend the rest of his life cherishing her. And Marin, her eyes blurred with tears of happiness, smiled and nodded, not because he was wealthy or powerful, but because, for the first time in her life, she felt loved as a whole and worthy human being. Marin's story didn't end with the image of a poor young woman whose life changed because she entered the world of the rich, but with the image of a woman who had walked through the fiercest storms and still remained true to herself, proving that a person's dignity and worth are never determined by wealth, poverty, or social position, but by the way they face adversity and cherish the people around them. Beyond the window, rain began falling over the city once again, just as it had on that fateful night long ago. But this time it carried neither fear nor loneliness, only cool, cleansing drops that washed away the pain of the past, closing a sorrowful chapter and opening the door to a peaceful beginning. Through this story, may each of us carry away one precious lesson, that no matter where life pushes us, no matter how poor we may be or how deeply others may look down upon us, Self-respect and goodness will always remain the most valuable possessions we own. Treasures no one can ever take away. And every person, regardless of status, deserves to be respected and loved. If you found something meaningful in this story, please subscribe to our channel, press the like button, and share this video with more people, so that together we can listen to many more compelling stories every day. We would truly love to hear your thoughts. What did you think of this story? And have you ever witnessed a moment in your own life when dignity and kindness overcame adversity? Please leave a comment below and share the feelings held deepest within your heart. Thank you for staying with this story until its final moment. We wish everyone watching this video abundant health, a joyful and peaceful life, and days filled with love. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in our next videos.